All right, well, welcome. My name is Elizabeth Anderson, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Society of International Law, and it's great to have you here tonight at Tiller House, our headquarters, and to have you here for this is the second in a series of 3 of these programs that we are co-hosting together with the American University of Washington College of Law, Academy on Human Rights, and Humanitarian Law, and it's a special treat for me because I get to play hooky from my day job here and join the faculty at AU each June, and it's wonderful to repay the favor and invite everybody down to Tiller House as well. We have a really special treat tonight in hearing from Christoph Heinz, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Executions. I was teaching my class on international organizations law this morning and telling the students that they had to come tonight in order to hear about the real life story of international law implementation and monitoring, and how a human rights body actually works. So this is a really special treat for us here tonight. Christoph is, in addition to being the UN Special Rapporteur, he's the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria and the former Director of the Center of Human Rights there. He teaches on a regular basis in human rights programs at Oxford and also at AU, Washington College of Law. He has served as a consultant to the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Organization of African Unity, African Union, and the South African Human Rights Commission. He is the founding editor of the African Human Rights Law Reports and founding co-editor of the African Human Rights Law Journal. He serves on editorial boards of international journals, and looks like in almost every continent. And he has 3 degrees from the University of Witwatersrand, the Yale Law School, and the University of Pretoria. And also has had a number of fellowships and other honors. So we're really very pleased to have him here. Our format will be to hear from Professor Heinz for a bit about his work as Special Rapporteur. He's going to focus on 3 countries, his particular case studies, to illuminate and illustrate how he works. And then we'll open it up and have a fair bit of time for question and answer from the audience. So without further introduction, please welcome Professor Heinz.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity. I've never thought of myself as a human rights body before. I think I'd rather put that on my CV in future than all those other things that we have there. I was asked to talk about my mandate and to focus on 3 countries that I've dealt with in the past, not because they are similar, actually because they are dissimilar, but to hopefully illustrate some of the work in which I'm engaged. And as Elizabeth said, I'm very happy to have questions and discussions afterwards as well. So what I thought of doing is to talk about the 4, I think, main kinds of activities in which we are involved, or in which my mandate is involved. I always, coming from a sort of NGO, Center for Human Rights background, and then later on the Dean, I always talk about we. But at the UN, they very soon told me you must say I, because it's you who assume responsibility for things. So let me say then the 4 things that I do in my mandate. And those are country visits, communications, informatic studies, advocacy. And then as far as country studies, I'll talk a bit about India, communications about Sri Lanka, and then advocacy about Syria. So those are the sort of 7 moving parts, but hopefully that will help yourselves and myself to keep to a bit of structure about this. But perhaps just to start off on a more sort of general level, the mandate of Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Summary, Arbitrary Executions, the very name to me always sounded like quite a mouthful, and especially the Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Executions part. But a year and a half ago, when I was appointed, I was in England actually, and one of the students there, they had a function that evening, and they were passing on a guitar and people were singing and so forth. And then one of the students came and said, well, congratulations with your appointment as Special Rapporteur for the United Nations, which made me feel that I had to sing for my supper there. So that's Special Rapporteur part, but that's more general. But then Extrajudicial Summary and Arbitrary Executions. And sometimes people go into all kinds of explanations of what that means, but I think it is actually, in a way, putting together a number of things that really can be put under the umbrella of dealing with unlawful killings in terms of international law, and in particular international human rights law, and also international humanitarian law. Although that part is a bit contested, when states are involved in armed conflict and their own practices are being scrutinized, they're not that much worried about it, and in fact they encourage you to also deal with it when the other parties' practices are involved. But I would say, although it's been controversial whether international humanitarian law resorts within the mandate, I think by and large it's accepted now that it's international law in general, and that it's really almost impossible to try to take out humanitarian law out of the mandate because there's such a large area of overlap between what they do. And if one wants to look at unlawful killing in general that invokes states' responsibility, then it's probably wise to keep it with human rights and humanitarian law. So if one looks at the main focus, the right to life, then, as articulated, for example, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 6, where it says that everybody has a right to life and that this should not be arbitrarily infringed by states. Now, the typical kinds of things that one deals with would be things such as death squads, the excessive use of force, either during demonstrations or during arrest, and I'll say a bit more about that. The death penalty, and one can ask yourself, where does it fit in if you talk about extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions? It obviously doesn't fit in under extrajudicial because it is judicial, but it fits in under arbitrary. So if the death penalty is imposed in an arbitrary manner, in the sense that it's either for somebody who's a minor, under 18, not the time of commission of a crime, or there's no due process, or if it's not for one of the most serious crimes, then it fits in under the mandate, which actually means then that the mandate is not in itself abolitionist. The mandate's power is to look at whether the death penalty is imposed in a non-arbitrary manner and then to address it in that way to narrow it down. But as such, the mandate itself is not abolitionist, whatever one's own views may be on something like that. There's also the issue of due diligence that the mandate addresses. So it's not only where the state itself fails to respect the rights, but also fails to protect. And I'll say something about work in respect of the protection of journalists, which is a major issue. Also human rights defenders, of course, and there's a special rapporteur on human rights defenders, of course, but in many ways the mandate overlaps with others. So, for example, on the right to life of journalists, I work with Frank LaRue quite a bit now on a report that I'm doing and that he's doing from his side as well, from his perspective as Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, on the protection of journalists. So there's overlap, but so also in that particular case, it deals with due diligence. It could be the state, of course, directly involved. It could also be drug cartels, for example, involved in threats to the right to life of individual journalists. So it's also on that horizontal level that the mandate looks at the issues of right to life. A number of other issues have more recently come into the mandate, well actually for about 8 years or so now, which could perhaps be a bit more controversial. Witches, the killing of witches. In India, for example, I'll say something about that. No, it's not only India, my own country, many other countries, this still occurs. And that's, of course, within a particular community. It's not a state directly involved. It's the issue of due diligence. Communal violence, for example, is also relevant. So it's obviously not every case where somebody's life is threatened, but it is every case where there's potential state responsibility under international law for that. Just looking at this list of things that we work with, when I came into the US and passed immigration, the person looked at my UN passport certificate and he said, extrajudicial summary arbitrary executions, I'm sure it's not as bad as it looks. And looking at this list, I thought, well, it is actually. But at the same time, I should say that it's a heavily contested area, of course. If you look at the different special rapporteurs, terrorism, heavily contested, torture, tremendous, because it deals with state security. Many of the others as well, especially all those things as well. But in particular, those three mandates deal with issues of state security, and the allegations against the state are actually quite serious. So it's not something that states normally welcome, in the sense that they can't look forward to your visit and hope you stay as long as possible. At the same time, I must say for myself as well, is that it is an opportunity, of course. You deal with these particular issues, but you deal from a particular angle. You deal from the angle of trying to prevent these kinds of things. So from that point of view, I do find it professionally and personally a very interesting and in many cases a fulfilling kind of job. Talking about contestation, just one other story that I wanted to mention is when Osama bin Laden was killed in May of last year. At the time, the Special Rapporteur on Terrorism was Martin Scheinen, and he and myself then issued a press release asking for the facts, because at the time it was very unclear what the facts were. And it is, of course, an issue is how do you respond to something like that, where you don't have the facts yourself, but it is life issues that are at stake, and terrorism issues as far as he was concerned. So we asked for the facts, and this was, of course, broadcast then as a challenge, questioning the events, which I suppose to some extent it is. But then there was on Fox News, there was an interview with a senator, a US senator, who was told about this, and he then asked, who are these jerks, these two people from the United Nations? I must say this phrase resonated with some of my colleagues, of course, and they were quite keen to use it in faculty board meetings, and it seemed to have some traction with my children at certain stages as well. But of course, the approach of states, often one gets the feeling that they take right to life seriously in many cases, but they primarily want to be praised for the millions of people who are still alive, not to be reminded of a few thousand who didn't make it along the way. And that is, of course, your job, is to highlight particular cases where people have been killed, and to, in that particular case then, to push for accountability. But there are also the other cases in which one has the opportunity, and I'll say something about that, also to serve a protective kind of preventative kind of role. And I see that really then as the crux of what the mandate does. At the moment, 46 mandates in the UN system, in the Human Rights Council system, because that's where we are appointed. 36 are thematic mandates, some of those I've mentioned before. In addition, there are ones on socioeconomic rights, such as the right to water, the right to food, education. And there's some that do not fit exactly into a particular right. The effect of foreign debt on countries. There's one now also it's about to be appointed, the last one on the environment. So various aspects. There's also international solidarity, which is not that easy to fit into under particular rights as well. But essentially it follows some of the specific rights itself. And then either individuals in most cases are appointed and working groups are appointed as well. If it's working groups, typically 5, also because the UN has 5 regions, which on the one hand results in 5 people making a statement, which is on the one hand perhaps stronger. On the other hand, I think it's much more difficult to find consensus in the group of 5, as the Security Council shows us. It's every person not has a veto, but potentially can derail or at least steer the events in a particular direction. So I think it is perhaps more difficult when a working group works with a particular issue. There is a lot of freedom in being an individual special rapporteur, and I must say for myself, I've never felt any pressure from the UN, from states, but that's the name of the game, and from NGOs as well. But one can really pursue within your mandate those areas that you think are important. I should mention there as well that there's a code of conduct for special procedures. So if you go outside your mandate, states can take you up on that. I do not necessarily think this is a bad thing, because also the code of conduct says you have to be independent and that you have to base your opinions on facts and those sort of things, which I think provides a defense as well. If you are unduly influenced, that you can say to a state, well, my code of conduct doesn't allow me to take this into account. If you bring me the facts, I can, but otherwise I'm not allowed to do this. It's also sometimes mentioned, I think just to understand the sort of background, that special procedures that we are not paid, which is of course something which my wife didn't particularly welcome when this announcement was made. And it's something which is often debated. I happen to think it's not a bad thing. I must say I'm in a good position at the University of Victoria, continues to pay my salary. But it also means that you're independent from the United Nations. And I find that also to be quite important, that you do not have to answer, there's no performance management or any kind of thing along those lines. And so it really gives you the opportunity to be independent. Okay, so there's one issue, just a preliminary one, before I go through these different methods of work that I want to mention to you, that I'm not 100% sure how to respond to. So I thought I'll just mention it to you, and it may be something that you've encountered or have some ideas on as well. And this is in the area of the right to life. There's been a number of studies. One individual study was done by Steven Pinker at Harvard, psychologist, on the history of violence, but also the Office on Drugs and on Crime in Vienna have noted that there's a very steep decline in the level of violence in human society over the last so many years. At least after the Second World War, there's been what they call the long peace in terms of international but also internal non-international armed conflict. The number of people who die overall, and the number of people who die in homicide. And they do this in all kinds of ways of looking at the graveyards of many years ago and the record of people who got executed and so forth. And they say all the evidence is, and it's really quite strong, it seems to be, that there's a decline in the use of violence, even if one goes before the Second World War. And Pinker's and others' claims are that the idea that the 20th century was the most violent ever is completely unfounded. He says that bad as it was, it is still much better than what was before. And then he rates all these different catastrophes, human catastrophes on a list going back many centuries. Now, if this is even halfway true, then it is, from the human rights point of view, something that one needs to think about. How do you respond to it? And I think there are two sort of responses possible. One is to say this sort of information or this sort of line should really be questioned because it is important to emphasize the excesses in order to mobilize people. You're not going to mobilize a room of people to go and fight for the right to life by saying, well, we're actually getting there. Things are going better. So this is bad news from a human rights point of view. That's one kind of approach. And that approach is sort of the advocacy kind of thing. If we say this is the most violent century, that's the way in which we can do something about that. The other kind of approach is to say, well, even if it's much better than before, then even one life that is lost. It's a bit like at school my teacher always said you should not divide by zero. She made it sound like the world would explode if you divide by zero. But that's very much the same with each individual life. It's of infinite worth. So even if there has been progress, there's still a lot to be done. There's no room for complacency about it. But we need to look at what has worked so far, and apparently some things are working, and we need to emphasize those to get to address these other issues. Now, this is something that I put up there. I'm not sure 100% myself how to respond to it. But I think from a right to life perspective, it is an interesting question to ask yourself from the point of view of advocacy of human rights issues is how does one respond to something like that? So I simply put that out on the table. The three countries that I want to look at then is, as I've mentioned, India, Sri Lanka, and Syria. I think India, because it to some extent represents almost not a standard or typical, but not an extraordinary kind of human rights situation from the mandate's point of view to look at. And I recently did a country visit there, and I'll say something about that. The other two, Sri Lanka and Syria, are both cases which do not really fit into this particular pattern that Pinker and others sketch. As we know, in Sri Lanka, the claim is made that about 40,000 people died in the last few months of the war, of the civil war. And in Syria, it may be 10,000, maybe 13,000 people died since March of last year. So these are serious cases where there's massive loss of life. In the case of Sri Lanka, there's been a bit of innovation that my predecessor did, which I think is quite interesting to look at. And then in the case of Syria, we're still looking for some kind of innovation or some kind of answer of how to deal with that particular sort of situation. So let me say something then about those different methods of work. I just want to make sure that I'm fine in terms of time. But please keep me to a time schedule. In terms of country visits, one of the things that special procedures do is to go and visit countries. Typically twice a year we go to a particular country. It depends on the country, whether it's a week or it's 2 weeks. Some countries actually try to keep you there for only 5 days, so they go through the motions, they have a special rapporteur, they can say to the UPR that they've had a special rapporteur there. It may not be necessarily their main commitment to have you there for a very long time. Other countries say, well, 2 weeks, fine, if that's what you need. And I think it depends a little bit also on the country size and the severity of the issues. It's not necessarily so as well that 2 weeks, that you really need 2 weeks in all cases. In some cases, it may be better to be there for a shorter time and to prepare in advance and then to do on-site visits. But that's the only case where you really get to do fact-finding. So country visits then typically, it has to the invitation has to come from the country in question. So typically what you do is you will approach a number of countries and then ask for invitations, and they invite you, and even if they invite you, of course, there's no guarantee that it will work out eventually. Some countries, Iran for example, has open invitations to all special procedures. India has now done that as well. But Iran, in practice, since 2004, I think, when they extended this first time, have not accepted special procedures. So yes, they can extend a general invitation, but in the end, you need to agree with them on a particular date. And if the date is not forthcoming, you're not going. And they, in fact, also in some cases cancel a week in advance, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes for good reasons. For myself, last year in November, I was supposed to go to Mexico, and a week before it happened, the person in charge of the war against drugs, as they call it, and a number of the other people with whom I was going to meet died in a helicopter crash, and so they then postponed the visit. And it's not clear with the elections coming up in July now when this will actually take place. In other cases, you do not know the exact reason, and it's just cancelled. The minister is too busy to see you, whatever the case may be. When you go, in theory, you've got full access. Again, this is subject to practical considerations, but in principle, you have full access to meet with people. It's not always that easy to meet with people, of course, if the issue is right to life. It may be that they feel threatened themselves already. And if they meet with you, they fear retaliation afterwards. And that has happened. My predecessor, Philip Alston, when he was in Kenya, 2 people that he met were killed in the week after that. So you've got access to everybody, but it's not necessarily that easy to meet with people, especially if it's in highly contested areas. But of course, there are ways of getting around it as well. You may meet with people not necessarily in the hotel where you're staying, but in the UN compound, and then they get into the compound and out of there in different ways and so forth as well. The area that I wanted to mention was India. That's where I was 2 months ago now. And just briefly to say a little bit about my experience there. In the case of India, well, I should say me, because it was myself and then assistant from Geneva and assistant from Pretoria, visited, and then you're accompanied by somebody from the government itself. We visited 6 different cities in 2 weeks across India. India extended an open invitation to special procedures. and before myself, the Special Rapporteur on protection of human rights defenders went, and then I did my particular visit. My impression was that in India it is indeed a fascinating country, 1.2 billion people, and the world's largest democracy, as it's often said, and in many cases, in many ways, functioning as a democracy in respect of human rights as well. It's a very highly respected Supreme Court, a Human Rights Commission which has at times done sterling work, and a civil society that is quite active, and in terms of their laws such as access to information and so forth, often protecting their rights. It was my perception that in respect of right to life issues that there are some significant challenges. And not that I'm saying all the other areas are covered as well, but I think generally a good record which has a particular challenges concerning right to life issues. And this concerns, and without going into any detail, but the Special Powers, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is operational in Kashmir and in a number of other of the states in different forms, which really give the armed forces the power to use force without accountability. And I think that is the main problem really that I've identified. It's not only the Special Powers Act, but there's also Section 197 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which also requires, in the case of police, for example, which requires sanction, as it's called, from the central government, authority from the central government to prosecute. And it's this impunity which then creates an environment within which the infamous encounter killings often take place, where there's a staged situation where the police say that there was a shootout, they were being shot at, and they defended themselves, and then eventually they shot the people who got killed. And the allegation has been made over many years, and I've met with a number of people who've lost family members in this kind of encounter, is then that these are people who are suspected of either being terrorists or being criminals or for some reason undesirable, and that they are arrested, shot, and then afterwards the situation is recreated to create the impression that they were shot in legitimate self-defense by the police. Now, I must say, with encounters, it seems to me there is a lull, at least. There's a strong decline in the use of encounters. There's still not accountability for many of the encounters that have happened before. But it seems to be a good opportunity now to address this particular problem. And the Special Powers Act, I think, is particularly problematic as well, because it creates a situation of almost a permanent state of emergency, which can be declared in effect on the spot by the special forces themselves. The number of other issues, the death penalty, for example, which is still in place and which can be imposed for non-lethal crimes as well. Nobody's been executed since 2004, so there's a de facto moratorium, although there are a number of people now on death row. It's possible that they may be executed, but in general, the death penalty, I think, is not the major problem. A number of issues concerning this horizontal sort of violence, communal violence that has happened in Gujarat, and we met with people there, Communal, where there's also not been proper accountability afterwards. Some traditional practices affecting women, honor killings, dowry killings, also witches, which are not that easy to address really, I think, in any society. Do you simply throw the law at people where this is ingrained part of the culture? Do they then not find other ways of getting around that? Do you impose, as it has been done, you make it easier for death penalty to be imposed in such cases, which create other human rights problems? Or is it something that needs to, in a way, be addressed culturally? And I don't think there are easy answers to that. I think there are a number of systematic challenges. This is what came out in the eventual report. If you're interested, you can have a look at it. The ones that I want to emphasize: justice delayed is justice denied. The fact that there have been a number of communal violence and other forms of killings that have not been addressed, and in some cases form over substance. The Human Rights Commission focuses very much on the existence of laws and say, well, we've got a law concerning the killing of witches, and we've got a law concerning direct killings and so forth, which I think is a very formalistic way of looking at it. So the mere fact that you've got laws in place is not necessarily already the solution. And so one of the things I pointed out at the exit press conference then was this focus on the law, which is important as it is not the final answer. Something that made a huge impression on me during the visit to India was that people came in the I think about 7 or so public hearings that we had in rooms like this. People came and they travel 18 hours on a bus to Assam, for example, from Manipur, and they bring the remains of clothes, for example, of children who've been shot and so forth. And it reminded me almost of the Truth Commission kind of situations that one has, which on the one hand is not a kind of situation in which I think Special Rapporteur should be to a large extent involved, because there is very little you can do for the direct victims, and you can create false expectations. On the other hand, it did impress on me the importance when there has been a period when a lot of people have been killed of some form of transitional justice. And this is something which I think is very difficult to do from the outside, and that's why for somebody in my situation, coming from South Africa, to hear people's stories, and they give you the photographs of their children 8 years old, all those sort of things, it's not a role that you can really play effectively. So one of the recommendations was in some kind of transitional justice measures in the society itself concerning the encounter killing, concerning the violence and so forth. All right, so that's just a bird's eye view of the visit to India. The second aspect that I wanted to mention is the communications that all special rapporteurs engage in. And these are the really two kinds of letters that you write to governments. So in my mandate, for example, but there are other mandates who do much more. I think I wrote about 135 letters or so last year. Many of them are joint letters as well. And there are two kinds of communications. One is urgent appeals, and then one is what is called in UN language, which I found a bit sort of strong, because UN, as you know, tries to downscale things. They don't call a complaint a complaint, they call it a communication. But they call a letter allegation letter. Am I supposed to send an allegation to a country? But I think it actually comes from the French and it's translated into English, but apparently it's been accepted. Now, in the case of my mandate, if the person is still alive, it's to put it very bluntly, it's a urgent appeal, and if not, then it's an allegation letter. And in the allegation letter, if there seems to be evidence of state responsibility for illegal killing, you ask them for accountability. In that particular case, proper investigation, accountability. In the case of urgent appeals, the other mandates have covered in a much more wide range of areas. I typically have it in the case of executions about to take place. For example, one would be approached concerning, well, in this country, there's somebody about to be executed where the allegation is that he has mental problems, serious mental problems. And those sort of cases are the kinds of cases that are brought to the attention where one would say, well, this is an arbitrary execution in terms of the standards concerning executions. Or other countries where minors are about to be executed, or where there's not been due process of law, or more serious crimes. Typical cases would be drug trafficking and so forth as well. So those are communications that one sends to the government in question. They have something like 3 months to respond. It's a very weak, or let me use the UN language, a very soft mechanism, because you have no hold over the countries in question. In my case, and I think it's typical for us as special rapporteurs, We get about 50% responses to our letters. The letters are published by the Human Rights Council. It used to be once a year when you report to the Human Rights Council. It's now 3 times a year on a rolling sort of basis, so it's more in the public domain. This year I think it's about 35% responses that I got, and this includes we acknowledge receipt and we send it to the capital. So from that point of view, it is indeed a soft mechanism, but I'm still amazed in a way, coming from almost a cynical starting point. I'm amazed by how serious countries take this. In some cases, some simply ignore it. But in many cases, they do take it seriously. And then once it's published, then NGOs take it seriously as well. And this is what I found with country visits as well, is that one of the most important things, I think, of such human rights bodies, is that in a way you give people the sense that you're not alone. There's somebody else interested in this particular issue. And that's not without consequence also, of course, for the rule that states have. In some cases, in other cases, it's simply ignored. So these communications then, I think, is a way of interacting, and this is also where I want to briefly mention Sri Lanka. And this is where I think innovation came about. My predecessor, Philip Alston, was in the post in 2009. I was appointed in August 2010. So when the war came to an end in Sri Lanka in March of 2009, there was, on the one hand, I think worldwide, there was a recognition that a very serious terrorist group has been defeated, a group who stopped at nothing in many cases, that has been defeated. At the same time, there was an awareness that the way in which it happened, at least in the last months of the war, really entailed unacceptable practices on a very, very large scale. So something like 2 weeks after the end of the war, there was a Human Rights Council meeting where, in effect, the government was congratulated with having defeated terrorism. In the worldwide situation where terrorism is an issue, this was, I think, one of the natural reactions. But there was no focus on human rights violations, and very, very serious human rights violations that took place during that time. Now that is where technology then comes in. Of course, there were many other ways in which this was conveyed as well, and you've probably seen the Channel 4 video on Sri Lanka, individuals who were on the ground giving testimony and so forth as well. But one of the ways in which what happened came to the fore was that people, and we do not know who, it may have been soldiers, for example, this is a term I didn't know before, but trophy videos, people who use their cell phones to film executions. And for some reason think this is something that they want to remember or want to keep a record of. It could be for many reasons. It could be perverse reasons. It could also be that in a way you've got a hold over the people involved. Whatever the case may be, it's very difficult to speculate what the reason is. But the fact is that in a large number of cases, people had cell phones with them, with those small discs on them, where they then filmed these events. And a 1-minute video came out of actual executions, 4 executions taking place on a beach. And then this was then mentioned. Normally these letters, communications, are letters where we're not allowed to do this on our own volition. We need to be approached by people, either victims, families of victims, NGOs and so forth, who give us information. And then we write a letter which says, without prejudging the contents, this has been brought to our attention, the allegations are, and then you put the allegations, and you send that information. What the previous mandate holder did then was to send this video to the government in question. And they came back and he wasn't happy with their response. And I think this is, as far as I know, completely new within the UN system. He then appointed 3 people as experts. One a ballistics expert, one a pathologist, and one a video and audio expert, to look at the actual. The ballistic expert looks at the recoil to say that this was live ammunition that was used. The pathologist looks at the body reactions, and the audio video expert looks at whether there is looks at the metadata and sees whether there is integrity within the footage. And he then said, yes, these experts have given their testimony, and he then reported to the Human Rights Council that these videos are authentic. But he said there were 4 problems, and very briefly, one at the end there's a frame, and there's also the date was wrong, and then there's a body movement which is difficult to explain. One person gets shot and then the body moves at the back, and a leg stands up, a knee actually stands up 90 degrees of a person who looks like the person is dead. So he said there are these 4 problems, he can't explain them, but on the balance he thinks it is authentic. Then I took over in August of 2010, and then 4 more minutes became available. And how they become available, we don't have the line of possession of the clip itself, and for that reason you would have to go to the experts. That was of course a question, do you go back to the same experts? If you go back to the same experts, or if you go to different experts, it may look like you are distancing yourself from the previous ones. If you go back to the same experts, they may say, well, you've gone back to people who probably have an interest in confirming what they've said. So, difficult choice. I went back to the 3, and then I got 1 more. And they then clarified all 4 these issues. They said now that we've got additional footage, we can see that the bullet goes through the one body and then hits the other body. And that's why this other person was moving. We can see from the other angle that the person's foot got stuck, and that's why his leg was upright. The date was manipulated in the editing phase on the camera itself, and the A is also manipulated through that. Then I reported to Human Rights Council again, and then a week later the Channel 4 video was then broadcast, saying again it has been authenticated, this particular video. Now that's a very small part. Of course, if you talk about 40,000 people, at least the Secretary General's special team task force reporting 40,000 people. It's only 4 in that particular case. There are many other videos of bodies and all kinds of very upsetting things as well. But those are the only cases where you see the actual execution. But I still think it is significant that in some cases you've got the actual evidence which cannot be denied. And it's something which in the interaction with the government has always struck me, that if there's some sense of accountability, you have the pictures of the people involved actually looking at the camera, smiling with a beard and very visible. The government's reaction was, well, we cannot have the identification parade of hundreds of thousands of troops to find those people. But I'm not sure that's how our military work. The military has a structure, and you know who is in a particular platoon. And if those 4 people are found, I think you've got an entry point into establishing who is responsible, and of course how far does the line of authority then go up in terms of what has happened. So I think this to me is a good example of a innovative step that was taken by my predecessor. It was very controversial at the time when he did it. He was strongly attacked, and even his own people in the internet, and you don't know where it comes from. It's on internet blogs and so forth. By the time it reached me, I wasn't attacked directly in any comparable kind of way. But those experts, there were, and we do not know who did this, but it was clear that private detectives looked at their history and published on the web, in this year this person filed for bankruptcy, and in this year this person his evidence was rejected by a court, or whatever the case may be. So it was clear that there was some serious background investigation done about the individuals involved. And that's the last point I want to make about that, is that the UN, like other human rights institutions, I think need to think about how to deal with these things, because it's probably better if one has a situation where you have a roster of experts who almost, by way of their job, who do that kind of thing. Because if you handpick people, then the question will be, did you handpick them because you know them? In my case, until this day, I've met the one who came to testify in Geneva. I've never met them, but who knows? It's from the outside, people don't know. So in the interest of transparency and all that, I think it's probably better if you develop some kind of roster of people who then eventually don't find themselves almost as human rights defenders, because that's what they become, who then find that their past is being placed on the internet where there's accurate or not. Okay, but so Sri Lanka, then of course we know where the situation is. In March of this year, the Human Rights Council took a decision which in effect overturned the previous one. India, which played a different role before, voted in favor for all kinds of reasons, maybe including internal political reasons, voted in favor of the resolution condemning, I shouldn't say condemning, being critical of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission outcome, and saying there must be a path forward, because the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, the internal Truth Commission kind of body, came up, I think, in some respects with a useful approach, identified the causes of the conflict, they admit civilians were killed, but in terms of accountability, I think that's where the main problem lies. And this resolution asks for a roadmap forward in terms of accountability, because of the scale on which things happen then in Sri Lanka. Okay, that's I think then a bit of a detour of communications, by the way in which this was used in I think quite innovative way. Thematic studies, well, briefly then, the thematic studies essentially entail that special rapporteurs get the opportunity to write a study on any topic that you find interesting in your field. All of us report to the Human Rights Council, some, including my mandate, report to the General Assembly as well. In that case, you report twice a year with a thematic study. Now, one of the thematic studies that I almost took over, and I just want to mention some of them, was the last one from my predecessor that he actually presented before I took over, was on targeted killing and on drones in particular. And I think what he did there was to put the issue very squarely on the agenda, the issue which is very much on the agenda now. But he put the legal framework, the legal questions on the agenda, and I think that's a very good example of how the thematic studies can be used to frame the discussion. And of course, if you want to, we can talk about that, but of course, looking at the New York Times recently and the story concerning the level of decision-making concerning violence, it's not an issue that's going away. It's an issue, I think, that is very much alive. It's actually becoming much more relevant. And of course, the problem with this, or I think what one needs to keep in mind with this development of technology, is that when you start, you do not know where it's going to. But once it's in place, it's very difficult then to regulate it. And then it's almost too late to go back, because then states establish state practice. And in this case, for example, the New York Times kind of approach is almost as if state practice is, well, it's not almost, state practice is then presented in the form where it's supported by opinion jurists. This is legal. This is how we do it. And you create precedents not only then for future governments in the country in question, but you create precedents all around the world. And I think that is the danger that happens, and it's very easy for this kind of thing to overtake you. And that's why I think it's important that a study like that was brought out. If you want to, we can talk more about that as well. The first report that I did was one on demonstrations, and that was in 2011 then. I started on it the year before, but then of course January the Arab Spring started taking place, and I thought, well, I'm actually quite lucky here in terms of the relevance of the approach. Very briefly, it seemed to me that I think two things I want to mention there. We looked at the domestic legislation of in this case it's really we, because it's my assistants who did it, of 76 countries, including Egypt, for example. Their laws came from 1913 and 1924, but those laws have been suspended by the state of emergency in England. But in many other countries, the laws regulating demonstrations are ancient, and they are largely reflective of, in many countries, with the colonial history of what the legal position was in Jamaica, for example. I think their law comes from 1815 or something like that. Essentially says if there are 15 people gathering, you can shoot. And it says it in very ancient English language. It's interesting that Botswana also has the 15 members cut off, and it's a bit more sophisticated the way it's expressed. But it's almost the same kind of thing. And of course, it's the colonial legacy that plays a role. I went to Zambia, for example, for a fact-finding mission to find out how it works in practice there. And I think it's, in many cases, international standards, that's not really where the problem is, although the international standards are scattered all over the place in the basic principles and the use of force and the code of conduct and so forth. And there may be room for some kind of declaration there. But it's not really that the legal standards on the international level is that unclear. But on the domestic level, it creates almost these kinds of situations where states of emergency may be declared, and the right to life, which is a non-derogable right, then in effect gets suspended because a person can with impunity then use force. So that was the one main conclusion, is that there should be domestic legal reform. The other one was that in terms of the international developments is that there's a strong focus on what is sometimes called in literature the safety triangle. That there should be communication before a demonstration takes place between the protesters, the police and the political powers. And cell phones and all those things play a role, of course. But this safety triangle, as it's called, and in South Africa, for example, I had the opportunity to talk to the riot police, and they say in something like 96% of the cases, they actually do meet before, and they have each other's cell phone numbers, and they say it makes a huge difference that they are able to be in touch with each other, and in a way have almost participatory governance of such sort of situations. So it's a move away from the escalated force model to the negotiated management model, which is often being used. Right, that's on demonstrations. My second report was on arrest, and it was on the Bin Laden issue came up there. And the one that I'll be presenting then on the 19th together with Frank LaRue, he does his own, is on safety of journalists. And in this particular case, we look at the alarming rate at which journalists are killed around the world. Again, the issue comes up, should you use the statistics that make it look very serious? Should you include, because some of the safety, professional safety organizations look at all issues of safety. But if you look at it, you find that people who get a heart attack while they're in an interview or driving somewhere, included as well. Of course, the figures look better, but in terms of wanting to mobilize shock almost. But I don't think that is the right route to follow if you want to emphasize the situation. It's much better to, in a way, do it conservatively, and those preventable deaths, and then, of course, in the case of people get caught in the crossfire, which is inherent in the job itself, that one focuses on those particular cases. Very briefly, and the report is already on the internet. Very broadly, the claim is made by NGOs who work in this field that more or less 70% of the people eventually killed as journalists get threats before. And that really means that, as opposed to simply looking at allegation levels in the end, that there's a possibility of looking at prevention, which I think is not necessarily completely used. And so in the report we try to emphasize both the NGO hotlines, but also the special procedures ourselves, mechanisms that can be used more also in preventive nature. I think the other issue that we emphasize there is also the need to escalate the issue from the local level to a more central level. And Mexico is a good example, where the prosecution is taken from the state level to a federal level, because on the state level there's much more possibility for intimidation and for witnesses or prosecutors or judges being affected. If it's more central, and then of course if you can internationalize it as well, then of course I think it's also one of the ways of trying to deal with this particular issue. It's also, what I didn't anticipate, it became clear that the major problem as far as the killing of journalists is concerned, something like 1,000 people over 20 years, is not so much the foreign correspondent, foreign war correspondent. Well, those are the people we hear about, and of course that is part of the problem, and each case is tragic. But the typical person who gets killed as a journalist is a local journalist who works for a newspaper or for radio. And that's the situation. The person goes home and there's a motorbike pulling up next to the person, two people on it, one driving, one shooting and getting away. And those are the cases really to look at. Okay, so those are journalists. The death penalty will be the next report. We'll be writing this in July, or I'll be writing it in July. Again, there's a huge drop in the number of people who get executed. At the moment, there's something like 97% countries that have abolished the death penalty. About 35 countries of the remaining, say, just 100, that still theoretically have the death penalty, have it on their books, still execute. And then there are, I think, 6 that still execute on a large scale. China, we do not know exactly how many. The Democratic Republic of Korea, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the US. Those are the countries where it's still practiced on a wide scale. The angle that we want to take here is to look in particular at the issue of most serious crimes. And that's a long story, I don't have the time to go into that. But how do you really define most serious crimes? And it's interesting, if you look at state practice is probably one of the issues to look at. But do you look at all states that have ratified the ICCPR? Or do you only look at those states that still have the death penalty? And if so, do you look at all states that still have the death penalty on the books? Or do you only look at those who still exercise the death penalty? And if you look at those who still impose the death penalty, do you look at the statistics for the imposition of the death penalty by the courts? Or do you look at actual executions? And my sense is that actual executions is probably the best thing to look at from a number of points of view. It is state practice in the sense of this is really what they do, not just what they say. But it's also probable that in the most cases of actual executions, it is for lethal crimes, which is really the core of what the death penalty, if it's used at all, should be used for. But issues such as the use of the death penalty for moral crimes, drugs and so forth, it will be interesting to see, and these statistics are not available, we're trying to get them together now, to see what do states actually execute for, and do they really execute for drug-related offences on the large scale that one may get the impression if you look at just the number of impositions of the death penalty by courts. All right, but that's an issue that still needs to be sorted out. And then the next report will be on lethal automated robotics, the question where drones, for example, take the decision, computers take the decision to kill. And as you may know, in a number of cases, some of the weaponry that is available today has that ability. And in a very crude format, landmines were like that, isn't it? Because there's no independent decision making that we're going to kill this person, it's automatic. But landmines have been banned. But we are moving to a situation where, for example, in some cases machine guns are set up and then they're activated by infrared or other mechanisms, and where there's still, as it's called in the military language, a man on the loop, still a man looking at it, or a man or a woman, I suppose. But what happens if you're in a situation where there's no human involvement in it at all? And the switch is simply switched over, and this is an automatic decision that takes place. And I think this raises a lot of questions, again, with technology, that one should probably look at before it actually happens, because once it happens, you have practice, and it's very difficult to get out of that. The responsibility, whose responsibility is it if a person is killed who should not be killed? Is it the programmer? Is it the person who wrote or created the hardware? Is it the military commander? Is it the politician? Who's responsible? Because that's really, I think, the central question that you want to know in such a sort of situation. The complexity or the unforeseen kinds of consequences. Will they be able to discriminate and take issues of proportionality? In some cases, perhaps better than a human being. And this is what some people say, well, they're not animated by revenge or fear or uncertainty. In many cases, they may be able to make a better assessment. But what do you say, even if that's true in some cases, is it true in all cases? And what do you sacrifice in the process? What about the decision to surrender, possibility of surrender? Isn't that a very basic idea when you think about right to life? That we think up to the last minute, a person should be able to say, okay, hands up, I'm in your hands. Is that something we want to protect? Although we must acknowledge that with many in many cases today, a weapon may be discharged in one part of the country, and it may reach another person in a few minutes with no possibility of surrender. Aeroplanes, no possibility of surrender. With drones, there's some record of people trying to surrender to drones. In many cases, it may not be. We may no longer have that. So how does one really deal with automated weaponry? Okay, the last one, advocacy, then Syria, and my own involvement there has been really on the level of the special procedures. All of us last Friday, I presented an intervention to the Human Rights Council when they took the resolution on behalf of the special procedures. So I've not visited Syria, I've done a country study on it and so forth. But I think broadly we're all familiar with the situation in Syria. The outcome of the meeting last week in Geneva was then it was the fourth special session of the Human Rights Council dealing with Syria. Of course, we've had a number of Security Council meetings where some permanent members have blocked concrete action against Syria, but have also condemned the situation. And there's a meeting tomorrow of the General Assembly on this. In the meeting in Geneva of last Friday, the Human Rights Council asked the Commission of Inquiry. There's a special rapporteur appointed for Syria, but he's now heading a Commission of Inquiry on Syria. So once that commission comes in, he'll take over the special rapporteur. But they were asked as well to look into the events at Hula as part of their mandate, and the request was made to refer the situation to the ICC. As we know, there's supervision mission with 300 unarmed soldiers, 100 people, and that seems to be increasing now. We've been agreed upon. And then, of course, the role of Kofi Annan as a joint envoy of the Arab League and then of the United Nations, and he's addressing the General Assembly tomorrow as well. I think there are a number of concerns in Syria. Of course, the current level of killings, which is totally unacceptable. There's also the concern about this either continuing or increasing if there's all-out civil war, although Human Rights Watch and others are already saying that in parts of the country it has reached the scale of a civil war. Also, concern that's often expressed is the question whether the opposition is organized enough to be a substitute government. There's also the concern whether there's a way out really for the president at the moment, with not that the ICC is directly on the agenda, but is there what is it? Hasn't he painted himself into a corner out of which he cannot get without continued use of violence? Is Yemen, the Yemen kind of option, is that really an option? I think that is what many people are saying is probably the best case kind of scenario. But the options range from the continued use of diplomatic pressure. Syria has been expelled from the Arab League already. Or the limited use of sanctions, either under, well, in different ways, but possibly under Chapter 7, or full-out military intervention under Chapter 7. Or then, of course, what has been raised is the possibility of unilateral, in the sense of non-UN sanctioned interventions. And that raises the whole issue, and it's a whole topic on its own, but humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect. To what extent is this something that is on the agenda? Is that a precedent that one wants to create as well, in terms of countries taking decisions on their own? As you know, France has called for this, some calls from this country as well for military intervention, whatever form it may take. But if what is on the table is some kind of unilateral military intervention, then I think it is a question to what extent that creates a precedent whereby one part of the world intervenes, which affects the whole human rights project really. If human rights is continuously seen as something which is done from a particular part of the world as opposed to the multilateral option. Of course, the multilateral option is not that attractive in itself because it's been blocked. And even if it's used, it's not that clear that it will really alleviate situation in future, in terms of the future government. So it is, I think, an extremely difficult option. It seems to me, the one thing that I want to say, it seems to me that the unilateral option is probably the least likely to, in the long run, to bring long-lasting change to that particular country. But so that's just an example of what I would put under advocacy, where it's not directly linked to any of the other kinds of mechanisms that we do. Very last point, last half minute, evaluation. I think the special procedures, the advantage is special procedures can move fast. It's not exhaustion of domestic remedies in terms of press releases, in terms of communications. It can happen very quickly. I think it's also there's serious constraints that need to be recognized. The workload, it's almost built into the system that you can only look at a certain number of issues. I think that's the last thing that that states want to do, is to create 20 people all the time, look at all these particular issues and come knocking on your door. So it's almost institutionalized that the workload is just such that you can only do a limited number of things. Limited resources, I think defensive attitude as well. Often states do not want to be singled out. And I think it's also a limitation that we are merely, it's a voice. It's almost you're patrolling the sort of outer boundaries of a particular right, and then you report on that, but there's nothing you can do about it yourself. So that's often very frustrating. It's not just frustrating to this particular human rights body, but Syria is a good example of this work is often very frustrating. So I think the limitations one need to be very much aware of. I think following from that, it becomes very important to work within the larger picture. For a mandate to do something on your own is almost impossible. So it's very important that, for example, increasingly we line up with the universal peer review. Countries also invite you before the universal peer review because they want to show that you were there. But you also go because you know that you have their full attention when you go before the UPR. So I think that's one way in which the different mechanisms strengthen each other. It's also very important for us to link up with what the Human Rights Committee says and so forth, and to be aware. So you need to link up with the other NGOs as well. And then something that I see as very important, and I think many of my colleagues as well, is to work with regional systems. And so, for example, we had a meeting in Addis now with the African Commission on Human People's Rights. They, in a number of ways, I won't get into that, may be working together with us. In fact, next week when we meet in Geneva, they'll be there as well. I think technology is very important, both in terms of it being something to look out for because it creates all kinds of, I mentioned some of them, all kinds of potential issues to look out for, but it's also something that assists the mandate. I've mentioned Sri Lanka as an example. And I think the new environment in which we work, where there seems to be a decrease in fatalities, this is something that one needs to think about, and I don't have the solution that I just mentioned at the outset. I think the concerns are then, as I've mentioned, technology, failed states, because that's where often people get killed, but overpowerful states, on the other hand, also I think is an increased concern, where on the one hand we can talk about Doctors Without Borders, but you can also talk about commanders-in-chiefs or presidents without borders who can press a button and somebody around the world can die. So two weak states, but also two powerful states, I think, are concerns from the protection of the right to life issue. I think I've actually overstayed my...
It's okay. We're wrapped, and it's been a wonderful tour of your mandate, and very impressive, if a bit sobering, the issues that you're dealing with. And I have to say, I think you're too modest, and you are somehow defying the constraints that the rest of us suffer under in time and space and physical energy, because you are doing an enormous amount, and on a pro bono basis, we're all, I know, very grateful for all that you do for human rights. I've got lots of questions, but I want to share and let folks around the room ask questions that they may have. If you can speak, we're recording the session, so if you can speak into the microphone and identify yourself, that would be wonderful. Thanks. Right there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrew Novak. I teach African law at American University. My question is, do you ever engage in like pure law reform in the sense that you see that a country has passed a law that authorizes some dangerous state of emergency law, or authorizes the death penalty for a crime that might not warrant the death penalty, or something like that? Would you wait for a complaint before you wrote a letter or raised your voice in opposition to something like that? Or would you sort of sua sponte just send a letter?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the code of conduct that I've mentioned, one of the issues is that we are not allowed sua sponte to look at particular issues, which typically would be an individual complaining about his or her case. So the communications procedure is that you have to wait for an NGO to approach you or victim, whatever the case may be. Of course, it's also, you work in a sort of environment in which you pick this up and people know about you, and I think it's what I've also tried to do also in the African context, because not many complaints come from Africa, although we know there are many human rights violations, is to make it known that this is available. For example, on the journalists, we are distributing a sort of a checklist now of all the contact details to make sure people know about it. Because in many cases, people simply don't know about the mechanism. But that's specific complaints. You started out by talking about pure law reform. When there are laws passed, this is more on the level of advocacy there. So if there is a law passed, and I've not done that actually in my mandate, but many of my other colleagues have done it, where there's a law passed, say on freedom of expression, for example, this is something they will take up in terms of a press statement, and that's typically not where they then wait for a complaint, because it's not part of the communication system. They would then take it up with the government in question. Terrorism, for example, I think they were quite active under Martin Scheinen. I'm sure they still do the same, is to go to governments and say, let's go through your legislation. The last comment there from my side is that with demonstrations, when we went through all these countries and looked at their laws and legislations, one of the questions was, should should I then really offer myself as a legal counsel to assist countries with law reform? And in the end, my conclusion was no. I simply don't have the capacity for that. And if I do that, then there are many other things that I won't do. So in a way, you have to ask yourself, where do you pitch what you're doing? And my mandate is more, I think, in terms of this sort of patrolling the borders and then pointing out issues. And then the technical assistance has to come from somewhere else then as well.
Okay, other questions? Well, I'll jump in with one that kind of puts in my mind. I wanted to ask generally about coordination among all of the special procedures and the other human rights bodies. And now, when you mentioned the technical assistance, that actually suggesting maybe even broader avenues for coordination within the UN system with, for example, UNDP or UNODC or some body that could actually, after you've done the diagnosis, apply the medicine. What's happening in that regard, and where do you see room for improvement?
Well, a number of examples. For example, the coordination between the special procedures, we now have, and I think it's been going for 3-4 years or so, but it will be my second meeting, is the one after next week, of all the special procedures, and we then meet with the treaty body heads as well. It's just too large if you meet with everyone. But with the treaty body heads as well. And one of the things that we try to do is when you go on a country visit, then, for example, to look at the country's record with the treaty bodies and with the peer review as well. So we follow up for each other. And my impression is that initially, when I was appointed to this job, I thought, well, what people say about the UN completely uncoordinated and bureaucratic, and one person said to me, it's not a question of the left hand not knowing what the right hand does, it's the left hand not knowing what the left hand does. I didn't see that. I see there's a high level of coordination, not perfect, but a high level of coordination. But within the human rights bodies, when it goes more broadly, there also are a number of issues. For example, journalism. There was a meeting now coordinated by UNESCO because they have the main mandate in respect of freedom of expression. That they coordinate all the different UN bodies to say this is a serious issue. let's look at that and let's compare notes there as well. On the issue of what I mentioned with Sri Lanka, the use of technology in terms of our fact-finding, I spoke to the people in Vienna at the old office on crime and drugs, and they've got some capacity in terms of forensics. They don't have on audio and video. They say it's too young a science. I was a bit worried about everything else that we looked at before. But they have on graves and on blood samples and all those sort of things. They have experts, which they say is available to us. I actually haven't used it, but why I engage in this discussion with them is to see whether we can also, in terms of video, audio, because I think that's going to be a major issue, also have in-house capacity there. They also have capacity problems, but they seem to be at least willing to engage with that sort of thing. At the same time, on the one hand, I make it sound rosy now because of the particular areas where I've seen it work. But I must say there are many areas as well. It's simply such a huge organization that in many areas you do not know. And one of the problems is you get so many emails already just from within the system itself. But I'm not 100% sure that information sharing on a larger scale is going to solve the problem. It's probably more targeted information sharing that is, but that depends on personal context and people knowing what you do. So even in the organization itself, I find advocacy to be important. People must know that you are the person working on that particular issue and not necessarily on something else, so that you can in a way weed out the unnecessary information to get to the It's a bit of a mixed answer. My impression is better than I thought. I thought this is going to be, because coming from university and knowing how bureaucracies work and terrible, I thought the UN is going to be bad times. You know, that's where you divide by zero, it just explodes. It's not as bad as I thought.
Hello. Quick question as to how do you prioritize your work? Are you driven more by current events, by individual complaints, by politics? How do you choose how to spread your precious resource of time across so many issues?
Well, I think if one looks at the broader picture, I'm in, as I mentioned, the fortunate position that the university is paying my salary, but at the moment I'm in a research position. So in practice, what happens is my research is not where it should be. But I think your question is more within the UN, within the mandate itself. And I think there the structures are to a large extent, these communications, for example, the urgent appeals are very urgent. So basically twice a day, I think you need to check your email for urgent appeals and to respond that day. That should be done on the reason. Delegation letters can take a bit longer normally, so that takes 2 days or something like that. But also if you go beyond that, then eventually you find that it's impossible. You've got too many, and you can't really distinguish them. It just becomes a blur. The country visits are 2 a year, and that's also given, in advance that we're going and prepare for them as well. Kinetic Studies are also 2 a year, so that's also quite structured. And I must say, from the research point of view, that's where I do my publications now, is on those very topics. So you'll soon see something coming out on safety of journalists and academic articles as well. But that is also where you know that it has to be in. With the UN, it has to be in something like 10 weeks in advance, and then you work back. And increasingly, what I've realized is that the mandate has a sort of convening power. If you ask people to participate in the research, that's where it's also useful that they know that you are a volunteer, because you can ask other people then to do it as well without offering them to pay. And they often also want to have their research and their input into the process. So far I don't think there's anybody whom I've asked to be involved in what we do now. For example, death penalty on 26th of June, we have a meeting of 20 people who come together, to Juan Mendes and myself, because he looks at torture and death penalty, and I look at the time issue. But 20 people, I think we asked 22 or so, and 20 are coming, and we meet in Cambridge, and then we have a draft report ready, and then not draft, a discussion document, and then they comment on that, and then we can put their comments into the eventual report. Much more collective effort. The first 2 reports I simply off 3 weeks and sat on my own in my study and didn't answer the phone to write, but it's unsustainable really to do. And it's also, you're not in the best position to do it because you're not the world's greatest expert on that particular topic. So get the people who are the world's experts on that, and you move on from one topic to the other and try to get a systematic line of quality control throughout, and then hopefully come up with experience that you will need to.
Kip Hale, American Bar Association. First of all, thanks for coming. The ABA has a State Department-funded human rights defender program that provides pro bono legal assistance to human rights defenders anywhere in the world. Despite that global mandate, we obviously need to focus on certain countries, and India and Sri Lanka, oddly enough, are two that we are. I would love to get your input on right-to-life issues and human rights defenders in those two countries specifically, an intersection that you see. Example would be executions or other arbitrary death due to right to information advocates, or in India, people publicizing corruption in the government. Thank you.
It seems to be that in India, a number of what you mentioned, corruption also, and it's not just India, but in India it came up quite a bit. People who report on multinational corporations, land issues, and many Latin American countries, there's the same kind of issue in Africa increasingly as well. And those would typically not be people we see as human rights defenders in the first place, but that has become, the environment has become a major issue. So in India, I think that is placing an increasing role. I must say I was struck in India by the vibrancy of the legal profession, and you may have the same experience, but even meeting with people in the hotel openly, there are, in the one case, I think there were 20 armed guards. Well, I thought it was because of my mandate we got to a hotel, and there were people accompanying us from the airport, 4 of them with machine guns, and they were in the hotel lobby. And the next thing I met with a human rights defender in the restaurant next door, and then there were 20 people with guns, and I thought this is ridiculous. It turns out there was a head of state staying in the same hotel. So it's sort of illusions of this was because of that. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by how vibrant the human rights defenders in the legal profession are. It's different, I think, and you're in the Naxalite areas with the individuals who are not in a way in the formal system, not lawyers. I think that's often where you get the problem with human rights defenders being attacked in India. In Sri Lanka, I do not really know about the legal profession itself. The cases that I've dealt with concern journalists, and I think there is a huge problem there with journalists. And that I mentioned the little sort of spillover that we saw in my mandate itself, with how people are hounded when they and it's not, I can't say it's the government, nobody knows. But in Geneva, it was a major issue, of course, in March when the resolution was before the Human Rights Council, how the journalists and human rights defenders from Sri Lanka who were in Geneva were harassed, and that it became issues to the extent that the High Commissioner issued a press statement the very next day to say that I do not want any reprisals. But we know in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, for example, journalists have written in their newspapers that I am being persecuted and I expect to be killed, and they are killed. And so I think it's difficult for me to say as far as lawyers are concerned in Sri Lanka, but I think with journalists that certainly seems to be a case that it's very difficult. There's also no-go areas in the country, and my sense is that they are under serious pressure. And human rights defenders in general in the country and outside. And the number of the communications that have been published as well concern that very scenario of a local newspaper journalist who drives back and motorbiking accident and the person's issues there. But with the legal profession in Sri Lanka, I haven't had any specific, except for the government people.
Yeah.
On the other side.
Well, we've reached 7 o'clock. I think we'll call an end to the formal discussion right now, but hopefully President Heinz will mill around with us and